back, and you've seen what the title of this panel discussion is: Rights and Freedom in the Age of New Media Conflicts, the Freedom of Freedom of Expression in the Triangle of Russia, China, and Syria. Can Cold War cultural diplomacy strategies be applied to assist here? Yeah. I would like to begin the discussion by asking the man who is responsible for the debate today and is behind the ICD, Mark, just to explain to us the Cold War cultural strategies that you're referring to here that may or may not be applied or reapplied.
So what's fascinating, I made reference to this earlier today, in the Cold War, one had, let's say, this combined strategy, which Joseph Nye refers to as smart power. And he actually gave a lecture here a few years ago, and Professor Nye was saying, for him, the success of the Cold War really was sincerely a success of smart power. When the Berlin Wall came down, it didn't come down by guns and missiles and tanks, but it actually came down by private citizens with hammers and chisels who wanted to get to the other side. They were somehow attracted to the other side. And we can debate, was it dissatisfaction of one system or attraction to another? But sort of this power of attraction definitely was there. So that's basically where Professor Nye would say was this balance. Of course, you had this threat of imminent mass destruction on either side. Of course, hard power was there. Nobody refutes that. But it was really the soft power that in the end enabled the success. So as we try to make comparisons, you and I were talking about this a little bit this morning, Peter. On the one hand, maybe it's a strange comparison. We don't live in a bipolar world today. You know, there are many differences between this period that we live in today and the Cold War. However, one does have a similar balancing act in the sense, how does one engage with certain actors in the world? Clearly, it's not only about the hard power. Maybe there are smart power strategies that could work through partnerships, through multilateral approaches, as well as unilateral approaches. So that would be, I guess, the one reference that we could consider when discussing also the Cold War period. Can anything be learned? The second thing to consider would actually be cultural diplomacy itself. As many of us know, in the Cold War, this was really one of the heydays for cultural diplomacy, whether it was jazz ambassadors being sent back and forth, or really this attempt to use culture to really convince that one entire way of life was in some way superior or more attractive to another entire way of life. And this is the second question. I think there, on the one hand, I don't think sending jazz musicians into Syria would necessarily have an impact. On the other hand, maybe there are certain examples where culture or cultural bridges could actually assist in the political bridges. Even in cases where you have countries that don't want to work together, or countries that don't necessarily want peace, or don't necessarily want the same resolution. Maybe also in those periods, there is something that culture can do. And one reference I'll make there, an interesting organization we work with from time to time is the street football world, where they actually are very successful using sports as a mechanism to actually bring people together who normally would never come together. For example, Israelis and Palestinians, gangs in Latin America, really fascinating examples where really peoples who normally would never come together do come together for soccer. And I think that's one example maybe of indirect cultural diplomacy. Something along those lines perhaps could also be considered. So I'll stop there. This is not a lecture, but those are some of the references that come to my mind as I look at, on the one hand, these two radically different time periods, the Cold War period and today. And it's sort of the question to the panelists, could some of these strategies be applied? Are any of these contextual similarities there in terms of the learning curve? So I'll hand it back to you, Peter.
Okay, what I'm proposing now is that we've got an awful lot of people in close proximity to each other, that we actually have a relatively intimate, straightforward, and dynamic debate. These are the panelists, the people down here. We've got Arnold Amber has joined us. The other people you know from earlier today, so I'm not going to reintroduce them. And we've got, sitting right next to me on my left, is Alexandra Föderl-Schmid. She is a newspaper editor from Austria. I'm not quite sure which of the two. Arnold, would you like to introduce yourself, first of all, and just some initial comments to what you've been listening to here?
In other words, you want me to start this thing off?
Get the ball rolling. Yeah.
Well, you picked the wrong person, because I wasn't too enamored of various Cold War strategies, diplomatic or otherwise. We had ping pong with Nixon in China, but I also I don't remember it because I was too young. But I've seen film, and it really was film, not tape or digital, film of the Hungarian water polo Olympic match in 1956 with the Russians, after the Russians put down the Hungarian rebellion. And the difference between a rebellion and a revolution is the rebellion doesn't succeed, and a lot of people were killed. So when you get down to this here, and if we're referring this to Syria, when people are shooting people in the street and the other group of people are saying we have to get rid of this government under any means. Cultural diplomatic moves seems to me to be slightly not addressing the problem. Vis-a-vis breaking down barriers that exist between people in various countries, there's all sorts of things we could do that would help that. But vis-a-vis Syria, I'm not quite sure how you move in, and I don't know what event or how many of these events, first of all, you get people to come to, but it can't be, you can't go around on a cultural event like a wonderful opera appearance or a jazz or whatever, while there's a hot war going on. And lastly, I'll say this, the reason that I wasn't too fond of the Cold War is what we basically did as peoples of the world was wasted 50, 60 years on fighting a Cold War. I personally, as a correspondent in various parts of Africa, saw various countries being used as operatives because they got money from one side of the Cold War or the other side. So for me, the Cold War wasn't a great experience, and in the Syria situation, I see it not being all that relevant.
Okay, let's introduce Alexandra now, who comes from a country I mentioned, Austria, which played obviously a very important sort of almost intermediary role, a sort of a cross-border role sometimes in diplomacy in Cold War times. So perhaps some insights there.
Hello and welcome from my side. I grew up 7 kilometers away from the Iron Curtain, so for me it's still a miracle, and I was 12 years correspondent here in Berlin. It's still a miracle what happened in the last 25 years, and sometimes I think the Europeans should be a little bit more proud of what is going on in this period, and it's really important, and I think we are in the middle of a fascinating time. I think I was a little bit confused when I read the title, because I'm not sure if we can bring all these different things together, because I think the situation in Syria is completely different. We do not have enough reporting from Syria. We do not know what is going on there exactly. For weeks we had no pictures, nothing, and I think this is also different to the kind of revolution which we all were confronted with in last year in the Arab Spring region. So I think in Russia there is a very vital and lively civil society. Demonstrations are going on, so it's completely different. And China is another thing, so I'm not sure if we can combine these things.
Ribal al-Assad, you've been doing lots of business between Syria and China. You're the only Syria... sorry? Between the Middle East, of course, between the Middle East and China. But you are from Syria. You're the only person here in the, on the panel from Syria originally. What's the relevance of this question for you in the Syrian context? Does the sort of the reference to the Cold War and the hard lines that the Cold War represented, I mean, does that have any relevance to you? Because certainly now the situation in Syria is much more sort of out of control. It's spiraled out of control because of the geopolitical spheres are getting very sort of mixed and murky, aren't they?
Yes, of course. In Syria, the only thing that we could, having common, of course, understand is that people rose up and they have enough of dictatorships, as it happened, here in Berlin. The difference is that at the time, there wasn't, when it happened in Berlin, people rose without Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or any of that. I don't think there were even satellite TV channels, or television channels that could get across to this area. So it was really something, I think, amazing, and it needed a lot of courage at the time to do that. Today, with what's happening in the Middle East is different. People, of course, have the help of of the media, internet, of the TV channels, and all of that. But it's still not. I mean, it still doesn't play that role. It cannot play that role as you know. Some of you have said Syria is. You know, how could you have, what kind of diplomacy you could have when the government is blocking everybody out of Syria, when the government is shelling cities, when the government is continuing on using excessive force against these people. So I think it is, in that way, it's very different from other countries.
Clive, with your great experience of 5 continents, Myrie, yeah. What are the Russians and the Chinese up to? And it does seem remarkably reminiscent of the Cold War.
It does, doesn't it? Their use of the veto, although it has to be said that, you know, the West, America, uses its veto on its own, certainly in relation to Israel, with the whole of the rest of the world in opposition to that. So this isn't just a one-way thing. I just quickly go back to the point that you were making about the difference. First of all, I'm not sure what the relevance of Syria is to this question. I think Cold War, soft power, or soft power strategies now are not going to have any influence on anyone in Syria. I'm not sure how Syria is part of this debate, but I think we need to go back to the Cold War and remember that you had. It's difficult, I think, for a lot of people to remember a time before the internet. Yes, we sort of think that Twitter and Facebook or whatever played a big part in the Arab Spring. And because the internet wasn't around back in the 70s and 60s, then how exactly was soft power used? Well, it was used in a very, very important way with Radio Free Europe, with Voice of America, with the Americans bankrolling pamphleteering, leaflets, publications. The use of soft power in the Cold War was very, very prevalent. So, yes, there was no internet, but there was a lot of soft power use, and various techniques were employed that were very important. It wasn't just Reagan outspending the Russians that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. A lot of people across Europe experiencing bread queues, not being able to go where they wanted to go, saw perhaps that life might be different on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Individuals on the street, their opinions were changed by Cold War propaganda. The question now is, given that a lot of Russians are wealthy, given that China's economy is expanding, how do you influence that? How do you change that now? How do you say to the Chinese, actually, you do need to allow freedom of expression, liberalize, open up? How do you get that across to a country that's rich, that doesn't have bread queues as the Russians had during the Cold War? And that's the dilemma that I think strategists and diplomats and governments have. And I'm sorry, I've digressed from your question. I'll go back to that a little bit later. But I think the way to appeal to Russia and to China is to appeal to their economic interests. The Chinese, while they're sitting on a massive trade surplus, while they're sitting on trillions of dollars of foreign exchange currency, they still have 700 million people who are living in poverty in the countryside. They know that they have to have an economy that grows at least 5 to 6 to 7% a year just to stand still. What American corporations are beginning to do is to appeal to that sense of economic interest. And it's exactly the same with Russia. President Medvedev visited Silicon Valley in 2010. He's a geek. He is an internet tech-savvy geek. And he knows that improving the economy of his country, he knows that maintaining living standards within Russia is dependent on the country itself developing technology. So it's not just making iPods in China, it's actually inventing iPods, inventing the next big thing. It's moving forward. And you're only going to have that if you have a free society where people can think for themselves. And that is the way I think the West is moving in trying to influence the likes of the Chinese and the likes of the Russians. So it was a big thing for President Obama to invite Medvedev over to Silicon Valley, and he absolutely loved it. Putin is completely different. Putin's an old Cold War warrior. He is stuck in the past. It's going to be difficult with someone like him, and it looks as if he's going to win the election. But it's the same thing with the current crop of Chinese leaders as well, I think. It's promoting cultural diversity in that way, in that tech-savvy way. That could be very influential in the future. Going back to your original question about what the Chinese and the Russians are up to, fundamentally, they are concerned about American hegemony. I mean, we sit around and we all say, hey, the Arab Spring is fantastic, isn't it? These people throwing off their shackles of their chains, and they're free to express themselves. Listen, in China and Russia, they don't think that. They think it's one huge Western conspiracy to push American influence into those areas of the world where that American influence didn't exist. And they were suckered, the Russians, they believe, as far as Libya was concerned. It led to regime change, and it led to America getting oil contracts and whatever, the West getting oil contracts and whatever. It led to America increasing its influence. And they're determined not to allow that to happen in Syria. And it was difficult when you say to the Russians and to the Chinese, people are dying, women are dying, children are dying, and they have to come back and respond, yes, we know, we think it was horrible too. They actually admit that. In the past, they would have just said, well, you know, it's a Western conspiracy or whatever. They admit that. But at the same time, they believe that this is an attempt for America and the West to extend its influence. And that fundamentally is a retelling of the Cold War story. And that is continuing today.
It's certainly the prism. I'd like to just one. Ribal was nodding massively while you were making those comments there. I'd like to just hear what he has to say specifically about that.
I think you're 100% right about Russia and China that are worried about the U.S. First of all, Russia has its own problem with the U.S. and its missile shields. And they think that America is coming closer and closer to its borders, and the same thing with China, who they think that there is that America has a policy of encirclement, and this also was noticed with the U.S. opening its base in Australia, with starting dialogue with Burma, and investment in Vietnam, Philippines, all of that. So the Chinese are very worried about it. They also see that there is a big threat even coming from India. And we could all see this. India is arming itself, and they're also preparing, I think, for a conflict. At the same time, they have, the currency issue with the United States, because China's economy has been rising for the past 10, 15 years. I mean, at in a very high rate, to 10 to 11% a year. This, of course, usually it comes with, the currency would have supposed to fluctuate and not stay, at, stuck between, certain, with like $1 used to be equal to 9 yuan. Now it's 7.5. But in reality, it should be much less than that. And the Chinese, the problem is that they're at a deadlock because the Americans cannot accept that anymore, because they're losing in the West. They're losing a lot of businesses to China. And at the same time, China cannot reevaluate its currency because they would lose all their growth, and all those companies that have opened factories in China would leave China. So this is why we see that there's a huge deadlock, and we don't know how this thing could be resolved. And on the other hand, it's also China's lack of transparency in its military buildup. All armies in democratic countries, we all know if the UK wants, to build submarines or to build, aircraft carriers, the whole world knows about it, how much it costs. If they want to buy, a tank, is same thing. But in China, nothing is transparent. They have a huge military built up for the past, 10, 15 years. And this is worrying a lot the West. people just wake up from a day to another, they see the Chinese have 2 aircraft carriers, which changes immensely the balance of power in the world. And this is very worrying. And again, going back to Russia in Syria has a huge interest because it's only way to the Mediterranean. It's in Syria where they have the port of Tartus, and as we saw, the Russians have sent their only aircraft carriers to Syria, and with 3 other ships. It was a huge sign to the international community that be careful, this is a red line. But the problem, what we're not seeing, is that everybody is been pushing. It's not like there is one side who's been backing for the other side. Everybody's been pushing forward, and this is why it's getting very dangerous. Not only that, but also the last protest that happened again, in Russia, it's also being blamed on the Americans being behind it. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, in the next month or two when President Putin is going to come to power to see how things are going to evolve. And I unfortunately think things are going to become much worse before they get better.
Now that we have Syria out of the picture, I think that I should make this remark about Russia particularly. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was attending the Congress of the International Federation of Journalists, which purports to represent the about 400, 500,000 journalists around the world. By the way, in the good old Cold War days, there was a communist-led Federation of Journalists, and there was a Western Federation of Journalists. Be that aside, we went to Moscow to hold our meeting because we were so disturbed by the number of people since the fall of the Soviet Union, number of journalists, whether they were major journalists who were uncovering immense corruption in Moscow, or they were in the outlying regions who had been murdered. In fact, during the course of our deliberations, there was a special time when they had the pictures of over 110 journalists who had been killed one way or the other, either by whomever, and all their pictures are up there. And each member who was at the Congress, and there were 300 or 400 of us there, went and, under the tradition in Russia, had some flowers, and you selected which person's picture you would put your flower beside. And it was a very moving time for all of us there. So the next day at the Congress, because it was in the middle of the Congress that happened, some of us said, why don't we have a demonstration in Moscow? We're all here from all over the world. And the Russian journalist said, you cannot do this because they will bring in busloads of goons, they will beat some of you up, and they will arrest us, and we'll get thrown out of our headquarters, which the government gives us some sort of a grant to run, et cetera, et cetera. Gave us a lot of reasons, and we never did step 1 foot out of the convention center. And then I look at a couple of weeks ago, and as a Canadian, I understand cold. And when I was told it was like 25 degrees below 0 centigrade, I did understand how cold that is, and that there were thousands of people who were marching in Moscow and marching in other cities as well. So there has been a change in Russia, and I think that change is partly because of the continual despair that many people in Russia have of the lack of real freedom. And the other thing too is that around this world, people get it, if they hear of a good idea, they take it up. And I think the good idea that the Russians people heard over the last few months obviously is the Arab Spring. And I think that one of the primary ways all this gets to Russia and people get together nowadays, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow, is basically with the use of social media, the internet, and so on and so forth. So I see this advancement in Russia. The Chinese situation, I think, is much more open to it, for the simple reason is that, as Clive was saying, and everybody knows, is that the economic interdependency between what is on the verge of becoming the world's dominant power, the Chinese, and the rest of us, is so great. In our country, in Canada, the Chinese in the last few years have come in and bought up some of our great commodity. We have more oil than most people think. In fact, we supply more oil to the United States than any other country. So they bought up a bunch of oil companies. Another thing that you may never have heard of before is something called potash, which is used everywhere in farms. They bought up a potash company. They bought up billions of dollars worth of companies, and they've done that around the world. And in an area that I'm concerned about and interested in, Africa, they've done that as well. So there's an independency between China and the rest of the world. And I think there are changes coming in China. What will not change so easily is that the people who have extraordinary power in China, which starts off the base of the Chinese army, are going to give that up. So you might see liberation on all sorts of fronts, but anything that threatens the power of the army and a certain elite which has developed over generations will be a difficult point. But that business that this is one world, when people keep talking about world trade, the Chinese are forefront. They're in the forefront of it all. And I listen to some degree to Chinese broadcasts from China, which are available. And they are talking about relaxing some of the things. But their attitude, what is sacred, and that's a funny word to use about a purportedly a communist regime, but what they believe is fundamental and cannot be changed aren't the same things we think cannot be changed. So we're going to have that clash down the road. But more change would definitely come, in my view, in China, and this cultural democracy of one way or the other, they're open to it. They're open to it because it's part of their new DNA. You know, from 48 on, they had one DNA, and now they have a brand new DNA. And unlike a lot of our people who think in terms of very short spans about making policy, they're thinking in 20, 30, 40 years down the road.
Alexandra?
I fully agree that a lot of things have changed in Russia, and I think we have seen in the last few weeks good signals, all these demonstrations. And also on the journalistic side, my experience is that the colleagues there are more aware of the situation. They speak loudly, and they go to international organizations and like IPI, which is sitting in Vienna, the International Press Institute. We get a lot of information from Russia in the last few years, and they say, well, help us in this and that case, so something is going on. And there is the European Court of Justice in Strasbourg, and for instance, we are waiting for 15 years now in some cases, but that's okay because they have to do more with cases and specific cases which are raised now from Russia and Turkey. Turkey is also, I think, a really problematic state in terms of press freedom, because there the colleagues are really under pressure, and the international community should be aware more about the situation there in Turkey. And I think the old strategy to send information from Western Germany and Austria to the eastern part of Europe with Radio Free Europe, which you mentioned, Clive, or RIAS, which was based here in West Berlin. I think this time is over because internet has changed everything. And as you have mentioned, I think cultural diplomacy maybe is also something which we should be skeptical if there is really the chance to focus just on this topic, because I think that more can be reached by using economic power. I think the international community, for instance, should put more pressure, for instance, to integrate press freedom issues in the WTO why not to say, okay, you can have free trade, China, but you have to agree to accept that the internet is free and that censorship is banned. This would be, I think, from my point of view, a good vehicle, and all the organizations which are involved and active in the field of press freedom should use more these economic forums, from my point of view. Clive?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really good idea, and I suspect it is what diplomats are exploring. I think part of the problem is that, you know, the Chinese are the biggest creditor nation at the moment. They've got all the money, and most of us in the West don't have any money. So it's actually quite difficult to lay down conditions when you're in a position of weakness. But I suspect from the diplomatic activity that I'm getting sort of dealings of, really, is that that's what they would like to do. And it's a good way of doing it, because the Chinese know that if, as I was saying earlier, if they're going to maintain the standard of living that they have, if they're not going to have a revolution, imagine 700 million peasants standing up and saying, actually, we've had enough of this. If they're going to avoid that kind of thing, because they see Shanghai and Beijing doing well and the rest of the countryside not doing well, the Chinese know that they have to be part of the international community, and they have to work with international institutions. And one bit of leverage the West does have is to say, okay, if you are going to come to the table, then you're going to have to do X, Y, and Z. I think the problem at the moment is the current economic situation. And this is where realpolitik comes in. You cannot, at the moment, lay down the conditions to the world's largest creditor nation about that kind of thing. I think it's difficult now, but it is an option, and it is something that should be looked at, I think.
On that point, I must say I've been very impressed in an almost negative sense by being around Chinese diplomats, senior Chinese diplomats, once or twice, and hearing them expressing their huge exasperation with the West as a body of thought that where we believe that we're getting it all right and they're getting it all wrong, and that is what we tend to tell them, and they've entirely run out of patience with that. You know, we need a major reversal on that front. We need to get into listening mode too.
Going back to what I was saying earlier about trying to influence the behavior of a country through economics. I lived in Singapore for a while, and Singaporean children regularly come out at the top of league tables when it comes to learning by rote, which is essentially what they do. But they're regularly at the top of league tables in testing. The problem is, learning by rote doesn't allow you to think. And part of the problem that Singapore was having, certainly as a result of the global economic crisis, was that it found that, yes, they were making chips, maybe not as much as Taiwan or other countries, but they were a nation that wasn't creating anything, that didn't have any sense of entrepreneurship, a sense that you start from the bottom, make mistakes, and something fantastic comes out at the end of it. That sense of innovation just was not there. And that was demonstrated by the fact that you had a ruling party there that had been in control pretty much since independence in the 60s. I need to be careful if I say, you know, the Lee family, if there's a dynasty or whatever, it's handed from the father down to the son, but essentially that's what happened. It wasn't a dynasty, but it's essentially what happened. And as a result, you didn't have a populace that was thinking for itself. And the Singaporeans realized, especially when the economic crisis hit 2007, 2008, that this could leave them stranded, that they needed to be innovative, that they needed to move forward. And in the recent elections in Singapore, they've got more opposition MPs now than they've ever had. They've liberalized the criteria for people to stand as MPs. they've opened up the country purely because of economics. And I think this might be the way to culturally, to use cultural diplomacy to influence particularly China, and I think Russia as well. And I think Singapore is a perfect example of that liberalization on pure economic grounds.
We've been talking, this whole idea of the Cold War somehow being relevant to the debate about media and freedom of expression and democracy and what have you, has introduced for me a slightly interesting thought. Is the Arab Spring actually a good thing? Everybody, of course, will, by and large, I would guess, nod and say, yes, of course it's a good thing because it's bringing more freedom to more people. But really, in many ways, what the Cold War was about is about zones in the geopolitical landscape being frozen in and being calculable. And that was very convenient. And my big fear is that at the end of the Arab Spring, where we had been dealing with Mubarak or Assad or Gaddafi or whatever, we will deal with non-democratic authoritarian regimes, and we'll be quite comfortable about doing that, and we'll have sold the people who fought for the Arab Spring down the Swanee, and the Syrians, what they've got from the Arab Spring so far is a very brutal civil war that looks as though it's going to get a lot worse. Just some thoughts that came to mind. I'd like to ask Ribal to comment on that.
Actually, yes, I think the Arab Spring is a good start. People should not think that it's going to be, I mean, we're going to have rosy democracies and everything is going to be great in the next 2-3 years or even 5 years. But it's a good start, and I think the international community has to go in full force now and help the people build civil society, education. People in the Arab world need a lot of education, and they also need a lot of economic help. I mean, a country, for example, like Egypt, with 80 million people, it doesn't have any resources. It doesn't have oil, doesn't have any minerals, it doesn't have anything. I mean, the only thing that it got is $2 billion they were getting from the US, and I don't think that was given to Egypt, at the time when they had peace with Israel. And this is a long time ago, and the $2 billion at the time, it doesn't have the same effect as today. It doesn't have the same value as $2 billion today. And also the population of Egypt has more than doubled from that time until today. So a lot of people think that it's going to be, like great, and people now will be eating more, and the economy is going to be much better. But actually, things also could go, extremely bad. Like you have, for example, the Salafist party has called to stop, for example, the beach tourism in Egypt, which would be a complete disaster. The beach tourism in Egypt brings around $12 billion and a half dollars a year. I mean, who do they think is going to give them this $12 billion and a half dollars a year if they stop the beach tourism? Again, the Islamist power, it was the easiest. I mean, those Islamic parties, it was the easiest parties to try to help to control Egypt, because you don't need to give a lot of money. You just give to those parties, and because the hierarchy in these parties is you give to the people on top, and then that's it. They'll, they control the people at the bottom. So we might find ourselves going to another way of dictatorship. In Libya again, NATO has bombed. We got rid of Gaddafi and all of that. But today you have everybody that's armed on the ground. People are selling weapons to all over Africa. They've sold 70 ground-to-air missiles to the Shabab in Somalia, which is very worrying. Tribes on the ground now are getting ready to get revenge on because NATO is not there anymore. I mean, they left all those people armed. The tribes that were with Gaddafi or backing Gaddafi at the time, like the Orfala tribes or others, who they make up millions of people. Those people are felt humiliated, and they're going to start getting their revenge. Or it's going to be again very difficult to get that country, I think, going to the right direction. I think the best, the best place where it has been working until now, I think it's Tunisia, because the Tunisians were already, compared to other countries in the Middle East, very progressive, very highly educated people, and they were also very resourceful. I mean, yes, it's true, Tunisia is a very small country with 11 million people. They have no resources, but at least they were the country who were having more tourists, than all the other Arab countries together. At a certain time, they had 9 million tourists a year, and they were living. This is why the economic crisis affected them the most, and this is why actually the revolution started in Tunisia. If we really want to understand how things happen. Yemen, as you've seen, it's again changing, just a figurehead for someone else who got, I think, 90% or something of the elections a few days ago. So it's again because Saudi would not allow 100% democratic countries to be on its border, because that would affect Saudi internally. So let's hope to see how things will move on. I'm not very optimistic, but if the international community, I said, doesn't intervene right now with money, education, and all of that for all these countries, it's going to unfortunately fall into the Islamist hand, and it's going to be, again, another disaster.
May I ask you a question? I'm not sure, but what comes in my mind when I read what is going on in Libya is maybe there could be a scenario like in Afghanistan, because I reported several times from there in different times, and the only aim was to get rid of Mr. Najibullah. And there were 13 different Mujahideen groups, and they fight it against each other. And then the Taliban split off. So do you think there could be a similar scenario in Libya? Because at the moment there are also different groups, and they wanted to get rid of Mr. Gaddafi. This happened, and what is coming next?
I think you're 100% right. I think it could become a situation if, as I said, if the international community doesn't intervene there, it could become even worse, because Libya has a lot of oil. So, but this is why I don't think that the international community would allow Libya, I think, to become something like Afghanistan. That would be even a disaster for Europe, because it's much closer to Europe, and it's they have a lot of economic interest in there. But still, what we've seen until now, there hasn't been any forces on the ground to take away those weapons they have given to all those people. Everyone is armed. Al-Qaeda is very strong on the ground. This ex-Guantanamo prisoner and one of Al-Qaeda members, Abdel Hakim Belhaj, he's one of the strongest people in Tripoli. Actually, he's even stronger than Abdel Jalil, than the president, the interim president, and that's very dangerous. He even went to Turkey, and he took with him 800 Libyan soldiers to send into Syria 3-4 months ago. So if Libya becomes really a base for Al-Qaeda and extremist fighters, that will be really a disaster, not only for Libya, it will be for all the African countries, all its neighbors, and other countries where they will be exporting, training other Islamists.
But do you really think that the Europeans will intervene again?
I mean, I hope they do. Could you imagine all those people with arms and money? How disastrous that would be, and that close from Europe. I think they were already suffering from illegal migration. Europe was already, Italy was complaining about it, France and other countries. So could you imagine now, under these circumstances, how disastrous it would be, and how easily they could send the armed people even into Europe, and that
this would mean that you have to send soldiers.
Yes, I think the only solution, you have to have soldiers on the ground. Of course, you have to have. You cannot just bomb and leave the place to the people and say, just try to do something. Try to resolve your issues with each other. That's a complete disaster.
But this is not just about the resistance being put up as it is at the United Nations by the Russians and the Chinese. This is also about the the West, the international community, as we were never quite sure what we call ourselves and who's part of the club, but there has been a dramatic loss of credibility on the one hand and also self-belief on the other.
Yes.
It's a major problem.
It is a major problem because, you know, usually you cannot just bomb the place and leave it for different parties. You know, what happened with all the fighters who were backing Gaddafi? What happened with all the tribes? You know, how could you leave a tribe that accounts for 1.5 million who was backing Gaddafi? What are they going to do today? You know, they haven't. I don't think that they have envisaged for all those different scenarios. What could be taken? What could be coming next on the ground?
Arnold, you've been very quiet, but you're thinking your thoughts.
Yes, but I don't want to scoop myself about what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. So I'm actually, you know, making sure that I don't go too far. But, you know, the biggest problem about winning the revolution is winning the revolution. What comes next? Like, if you want to judge big revolutions, and I'm not putting down each country, for that country it's a big revolution, but let's say the Russian Revolution. Some of the people that made the Russian Revolution were not the people that took over. 6 months after the Russian Revolution was finished, a group called the Bolsheviks took over from a group called the Mensheviks. What might have happened to the Russian Revolution had that not been the case? Who knows? We do know what happened because the Bolsheviks took it over, and within a few years it was Stalinized, and away we went. So the problems that face these countries right now in the Arab region are not dissimilar to all the other revolutions that have gone on. You know, taking power from somebody means you have to replace that. And the other thing that you always have to remember is that we always end up, when there's a dictatorship, talking about the person who's the head. And in some countries, that person who's in the head actually does all the terrible things that are attributed about that country. But in many cases, it's the 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, no matter how big the country is, of people that live because they support the dictator, and the dictator keeps them employed and supports them. And it gives them position, it gives them wealth, it gives them all sorts of possibilities in certain countries of stealing money. So it is a very, very complicated issue, this regime change, to use somebody else's words, not mine. We've seen it everywhere. It's never easy, and there are stumbling blocks once the revolution succeeds. Some of the things that are going on in Libya now are just what the West said we're going to go in to prevent. You know, the killing of people, just in a case of revenge or whatever. And it's going on. So you do have to take a longer look at these things, and they're all complicated. A lot of there is no country, unless it's an extremely small country of a geographical, small geography, that also has all the people in that country come out of the same backgrounds. Every country we've been talking about is a diverse mix of different kinds of people, and some people who have extremely long memories. And memory is not about living together, but about problems that had existed between people now living in that country that go back 400 and 500 years ago. I was in Kosovo years ago, and that thing went back 500 years about what the Serbs and so on and so forth. So there you go. And all the way through, these are the kind of issues that come up. But before I relinquish this microphone, I have to tell you one thing about, I started off by saying I really had trouble with the Cold War. When I was in university, we would go to international meetings, or people would come to Canada in international meetings. And the delegations from the communist, Europe communism, whether it was Russia itself, or Czechoslovakia, or the Poles, or the Hungarians, they would always send a corresponding group to meet with the university people and a cultural exchange. And they were always from the youth wing of whatever particular communist country they came from. And I remember I'd seen one guy 2 or 3 times over the years, and I said to him, well, I don't forget what his name was from Russia. And he said, this is the last time I'm going to see you. And I said, why? He said, well, you know, I've reached the age now where I no longer will be considered a youth. I said, well, you know, I've always wondered about that. How old are you going to be on your next birthday? He said, 45. What the communist delegations always were made up of people between 30 and 40, and all the other people from, quote, the West were people like me. We were 21, 22, and there was no doubt that most of the delegations were not there because they were youth. They were actually part of the apparatus of the particular Communist Party in that country. It's just, the reason I bring it up is it struck me as being an unreal situation about cultural exchange. Cultural exchange has to be a little bit deeper than this party meeting that party when they're so fraught with political underpinnings to what this is all about.
One of us finally gets the microphone. Okay. Each of you kind of touched on this, but I guess I want to say is that economics or anything like that is not going to solve anything. Economics hasn't solved anything in 3,000 years. The West, as a people, as a culture, as a political system, has to change its image. For example, we spoke about China. The thing is, the Chinese, the Russians can all throw this stuff back at us. The Russians and the Chinese, they think the history lessons differently. They think in terms of cyclical memory, whereas us in the West think in terms of linear memory. The Chinese remember the century of humiliation. The Russians remember the invasion of Vladivostok and Archangel, and they don't forget that. And also in Latin America, they haven't forgotten dollar diplomacy at all. And now you have the Venezuelans, the Bolivians, Nicaraguans, creating an alternate to the OES, Organization of Latin American States, something like that. So I do think that culture has to play a role in it somehow, in changing our own, not only our own image, but the rest of the image as well. But yeah, that's all I have to say.
Excuse me, I've been a little bit lost in all this because my comment here, half at the back of my mind, we're talking of freedom of expression and cultural diplomacy. Most of the stuff you've been talking about is politics. And I still think that we haven't even started the real reason or the real topic of what is there, because it's becoming a little bit boring to me. And with all due respect, I would rather want us to go straight to the real issue, because what we are talking about here doesn't even
do it.
Personally, it doesn't go down at all. Thank you.
What is the real issue in your mind?
When we're talking of freedom of expression, even I'm not even here in Germany, a very well-developed country like this. Is there really freedom of expression here? I can say maybe 50% or 100. Definitely, it's not up to 80%. What is culture? We are talking of cultural diplomacy now in this issue, and we should be talking about countries. When we raise like 3 topics, like there's Russia, there's China, there's Syria. Syria, definitely there's nothing like human rights in Syria presently, and there's nothing like freedom of expression. If we're going to talk about it now, if we major on it, it's just recommendations of what everybody is going to resolve an issue, how we think Syria is going to change, or how we think the government is going to, the international community is going to help Syria. Like China is a well-developed, it's greatly economically. And yet the people there, they are still in bondage, because maybe it is only 5% of them that really have the liberty of expressing themselves. Before you can stand up to do something, you're already trampled by the government. We should be talking about that. That is what I think, or maybe we can even go back to Africa, where the real issue, I think this issue should be centered in Africa. And but what we've been talking about since, personally, is all politics. I don't know. That is it.
I just had one comment then. I just went and checked my statistics. But the United States leads the world in guns per capita. For every 100 residents, there are 88 guns. Well, if you just do the arithmetic, that's almost a gun for every person in the country. China is number 131 on the list. Now, that does not necessarily, it's just empirical data, but one can draw one's own conclusions from that. The other thing is that we talked about Russia and China. I kind of agree with what he had to say, but when we talk about Russia and China, they lead the world in prison population, except for one thing. The United States is number 1 on the list, with 25% of the world's prison population. If we talk about freedom of expression, we're going to have to factor facts like that into the discussion. Thank you.
Who would like, we've got 1 or 2 points. One is that the discussion was too abstract, was not getting anywhere near the nub as you would have seen it. We need to talk about a proper active role for cultural diplomacy, possibly, yeah? Applied rather than just nice liberal people sitting in a room waffling. We've got a trade-off between censorship and trade, yeah? Proposed, yeah? And we've got stats that don't sound very good. Does anybody want to have a go?
First of all, it says Russia and China and Syria up there. It doesn't mention anyone else, so that's why we're talking about them, number one. Number two, maybe I didn't explain it clearly enough, but I tried to sort of talk about the role of cultural diplomacy as far as Russia and China is concerned, in trying to change the mindset of the ruling regimes. I talked about trying to open up those two countries to new technologies. Medvedev visiting Silicon Valley. The idea being that if you have innovation and you have people thinking for themselves, that will maintain the economic prosperity of the country. And as a result of that, what Western interests should be doing is investing. There should be cultural exchanges. There should be Chinese scientists and Russian entrepreneurs brought over to those two countries. That kind of cultural exchange to increase the likelihood that those countries will move forward technologically. And if they move forward technologically, they will want their populace to think for themselves. And if they think for themselves, you liberalize and you allow freedom of expression. That's what I was trying to get across, and that's what I tried to get across as far as Singapore was concerned. So with the title being what it is, I think I've tried to express that.
I would like to make a point to Mark and to Ribal, if I might, because in response to your question, because it is something that sort of, that I find is sort of an itchy issue, is that the elephant in the room in so many ways in the discussion, and Ribal has mentioned this, is in many ways Saudi Arabia. Because we've talked about how there's an emerging civil society in Russia. We've talked about how China, for all its being an authoritarian state, still is a developing body politic. Syria at the moment doesn't have time for cultural diplomacy because there's a real shooting war going on. And if there's a role at this present time around the 3 countries we're talking about up here for cultural diplomacy, I would have thought that the place to be building the bridges, to be knocking on the door, is Saudi Arabia. Because it has so much influence, and it is still a pacified society, so influence can be taken. It's not in a situation of breakdown. You know, that's a hint possibly for the future.
We were talking a little bit earlier in the discussion about the influence of Iran on Syria. I mean, should we be using cultural diplomacy techniques, ideas on Iran to change the way that they perceive the rest of the world and they perceive us? And as a result, what effect would that have on Iran's client states, Hezbollah, Libya, Syria, whatever?
I would like to make a tiny, very personal point on that. The movie that won the best foreign language movie the other evening, A Separation, it is the best bit of cultural diplomacy I have seen for an awful long time, both ways. Yeah.
I think we failed today in freedom of expression. I'll say why. there's so many people here in the room, but today what I saw during the panel discussion was mostly more of a monopoly of expression. So just thought I'd say that.
But the Berlin Spring could have risen up and grabbed the microphone. This is not a police state, yeah?
Thank you for you. Good morning. Guten Tag. I have just come from Syria. Just stand up. Okay. Okay. I have just come from Syria. You are talking about Syria exactly as you were talking about Einstein. Syria is a regime consisted of martial laws for 50 years, militias ruling Syria for 50 years, no judiciary justice, no judiciary construction of the state, no justice at all. We had 3 official newspapers in Syria for 45 years now, and we have nothing else. We have one state TV channel, and we have one president who inherited the power from his father, not from the elections or referendum or etc., etc. Syria is bloodshedding 150 persons every day. So it's not a matter of epistemology, culture, or etc., etc., oil. There is a catastrophic. We have a Holocaust in Syria. Indeed, it's Holocaust. If I am a Syrian, I am deemed to talk about Jewish Holocaust, and I confirm, and I do reconfirm, please talk about the Holocaust in Syria, which have surpassed all measures, tracts, and elements of what has happened in history. So please go towards Syria a little bit more, and let's not to generalize, let's talk in details, and I am ready to supply you with all reports and figures which show up what is really and indeed going into Syria now. Thank you.
Thank you. We shall continue after lunch.
Would you like to introduce yourself just very quickly? Introduce yourself, who you are. And if everyone would do that before they speak, that would be great.
My name is Habib Saleh. I am a member of Syria National Council, leading the opposition abroad in Syria. I am a writer and a journalist. I have been detained. I have been consciously detained for 21 years in Syria. And I have been only set free last May. Spent 2 months in Lebanon, and I am here since 1st of November in Berlin. Thank you.
Thank you.